We last visited Egypt in around 2500 BCE, the height of the Old Kingdom's fourth dynasty, and the three great pyramid pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. I hope you fastened your time machine seatbelts, because now we're jumping forward about 1,000 years. I am skipping over civil war, invasions, an entire set of very successful dynasties, the Middle Kingdom, and still more invasions. Sorry about that. We are landing in the New Kingdom. Make sure your seats are upright and your tray tables are fully fastened. So just how new is this New Kingdom anyway? If we look at a series of pharaoh statues moving from Khafre enthroned, 2570 BCE, to King Tut's inner coffin, 1320 BCE, it doesn't look as if much has changed in Egyptian art or culture over 1,200 years, and there is a lot of truth to that. The pharaoh remained an all-powerful ruler, semi-divine, responsible for maintaining Ma'at and securing the safety and prosperity of the kingdom. But New Kingdom Egypt is at least somewhat new. The map on the left shows Old Kingdom Egypt, really just a narrow strip of land on either side of the Nile. As the map on the right indicates, in the New Kingdom, Egypt became an imperial power. This means that Egyptian pharaohs had to impose their authority not only on Egyptians, but on peoples that they conquered. So this isn't a required work, but note that Ramses II, probably the most powerful New Kingdom pharaoh, built this temple to himself down at the border with Nubia, today's Sudan. Think maybe he was trying to make an impression on newly conquered peoples? All four of those statues, by the way, are of Ramses himself. You'll note that Ramses is decked out pretty much like all the other pharaohs we've studied, but the choice to glorify himself with a temple rather than a pyramid is typical of the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom also brought some changes to the concept of pharaoh and his depiction in art. During the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh ruled as the son of God, the incarnation of Horus, son of Osiris. But during the New Kingdom, the pharaoh featured increasingly as the chosen representative of the gods on earth, one who was serving the gods. So much of the art from this period shows the king being embraced or touched by the gods, making offerings and receiving symbols of divine support. So here you see a bas-relief sculpture from an Egyptian temple. The New Kingdom pharaoh Seti I is making offerings to Amun. As you can see from this diagram, temples had always been part of the pyramid complex, but pharaohs stopped building pyramids after the Old Kingdom fell. There are many theories about why this happened. Pyramid tombs were constantly robbed, so the pharaohs started digging secret tombs deep in the halls, away from temples where the now deified pharaoh was worshipped. The human and financial cost of building the pyramids put pharaohs deeply in debt and indeed may have helped bring down the Old Kingdom. But then the temples we're about to see didn't come cheap either. New Kingdom temples fall into two general categories, temples to gods and temples to pharaohs. But that's a little misleading, since temples to pharaohs, like the temple at Abu Simbel that you just saw, always included rooms devoted to the gods, especially the chief god of the New Kingdom, Amun-Re. When the founder of the 18th dynasty expelled the Hyksos invaders, his hometown, Thebes, became the most important city in Egypt. Thebes' patron deity was Amun, whose identity merged with the sun god Re, already worshipped throughout Egypt. The pharaohs of the new dynasty attributed their many military victories to Amun, and they lavished much of the loot they captured on temples to this god. The temple at Karnak is the largest, and indeed it is the second largest ancient religious site in the world, second only to Angkor Wat Temple of Cambodia. Stay tuned for Unit 4. Your readings gave you a lot of information about this famous site and introduced some vocabulary terms that are very likely to show up on your exam. So let's review quickly. What's circled in red? That is a pylon gate. Note the slanting sides. They represented two mountains, between which, according to the Egyptian religion, the sun rose and sat. And the green circle? That's a bird's-eye view of the Hypostyle hall, really a forest of columns. Let's watch the first of several short video clips from a documentary on this temple. The entire video in 3 parts is up on Moodle, and of course, as always, I highly recommend it, although it probably deserves an R rating. Why? Watch it and find out. For now, we're just making a flyover. The temple at Karnak actually had a series of pylon gates built over time. Construction of this temple began in the Middle Kingdom and continued through to the Greek Ptolemaic dynasties, which included Cleopatra, who hung out with Julius Caesar at the very end of the period we call BCE. More than 30 pharaohs added to buildings or rooms to this temple, and sticking on a few more pylons was a favorite form of remodeling. So what purpose did these pylons serve? What was their function and what was their meaning? Well, they weren't holding anything up the way bridge pylons do. Instead, they were designed to impress, if not overwhelm. Anyone entering these gates was entering the precincts of the gods, and most people could not enter the gate. The temple was a sacred precinct, the actual house of the gods. So the pylons were also a kind of barrier between the daily world of the people and the eternal world of the gods and the pharaohs. This plan, which is a required work, shows the additions made by different pharaohs. You don't have to memorize these, but make sure that you can read the plan and that you know that there were additions. So after going through the pylon gates, the worshiper would enter a large courtyard. From there would move into the Hypostyle hall. That's all those dots in the center left of the plan. Those represent columns in a floor plan. This is called an axial plan. Basically, entrance to succeeding rooms is straight along an axis down the center. The College Board's required image of the Hypostyle hall on the upper left doesn't really give you a very good sense of how vast this forest of columns really is, so I've included a panoramic shot. Note how small the people are in comparison with the columns. The columns were elaborately carved in sunken relief, a form of sculpture that created deep shadows and had the additional virtue that it did not disguise the basic circular shape of the columns. Here you see two examples of relief sculpture on the left. On top, Ramses II making offerings to Amun-Re. On the bottom, Seti I smiting some Libyans. Note the two justifications for the pharaoh's rule haven't changed since the Palette of Narmer. The pharaoh assures a close relationship with the gods, and the pharaoh wins wars. There were lots of raised relief sculptures at Karnak as well. On the upper right, you see Seti I offering an ointment jar to a god. The images are somewhat misleading, however, as these relief sculptures would have been brightly painted, as the model indicates. The photo on the left also shows the hugely important architectural innovation that first appeared in New Kingdom temples, high clerestory windows that let in light. That term shows up on the AP test all the time, by the way. Hypostyle halls were actually intended to represent a marsh back at the beginning of time, a primordial marsh. The columns were meant to resemble papyrus plants. In the dark corners, the columns look like papyrus plants with closed flowers. In the center, where light shone in, the columns look like papyrus plants blooming in the sun. It's important to understand that ancient Egyptian temples were seen as the place where gods actually resided on earth. In fact, the term Egyptians most commonly used to describe the temple building means mansion or enclosure of a god. So it's no surprise, really, that only priests and the pharaoh were allowed to enter the Hypostyle hall. Remember that exclusivity is one of the characteristics of sacred space. There you see those terms. The sanctuary was the most special and important part of the temple. It was a very dark and mysterious place. Only the high priest and the pharaoh could ever enter the sanctuary. In the middle of the sanctuary stood the shrine where the statue of the god or goddess resided. The ancient Egyptians believed that sometimes during rituals, the god or goddess would actually enter the statue. When the pharaoh wasn't available to conduct the daily rituals, which was most of the time, the high priest would ritually clean the god's image, then offer it food and drink. Let's watch another brief video clip that talks about these rituals. On special festival days, the cult statue would be carried from the temple to a boat on the Nile, carried to another ritual site, and then brought back. So let's watch one last video clip about the pharaoh's role in this important ceremony. Again, you want to keep in mind how the structure and function work together in these buildings. And now finally we move on to the second type of temple, a mortuary temple honoring a pharaoh. The dynamic duo again. This is no ordinary pharaoh. Let's turn to a clip from another also very good video and learn a little more about Queen Hatshepsut. The statue on the right, by the way, is one of your required images. I added the Sphinx, on the left. I added the Sphinx because I think it's cool. Both are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and both were painstakingly reconstructed from fragments. Let's watch the video and find out why. I'm not going to say a lot more about the temple, you just saw it on video, but here are a few vocabulary words you might need to know. I haven't seen these terms on an AP exam in the past, but this work is receiving more focus now. The plan is not a required image, but I included the labeled plan in your workbook. Note that the temple includes shrines to gods other than the pharaoh. Also notice the two long causeways leading up to the chamfered pillars, past the colonnades, and beyond them to the Hypostyle hall. I mentioned that the Met reconstructed these statues from fragments. Hatshepsut's stepson, Thutmose III, had all of the statues of the female pharaoh destroyed. And why was that such a violent and shocking act? Let's watch one last video clip. Remember, the pharaoh's Ka actually lived in these statues. Destroy the statues, destroy the Ka, and Hatshepsut's chance at the afterlife. And alas, this is all the time we have for this fascinating pharaoh. The next pharaoh will turn out to be stranger still. Stay tuned.